Welcome back to Footlong With American Cheese with Andrew,
Misbah,
and Anik.
Today's episode will be on period 5 of A Push. Last episode we left off with the Mexican-American War, which kind of led into these sectional tensions between the North and the South over the newly gained territory and whether or not they should be slave states or not.
Yeah, so we got California, Arizona,
New Mexico, Texas.
Basically all them Western boys.
Yeah. Have you ever been to Six Flags and been to the Southwest Territory section of it? Imagine that kind of
The Wild West.
Yes.
The Raging Bull, the Giant Drop.
Yeah.
All that.
Those roller coasters were not present at the time.
Most people usually start left though, and they go to Six Flags. It's Superman.
Yeah. Wait, no, people don't.
Well, most people do.
No.
Yeah.
No.
Yep.
No.
Yep. Which way does the clock go?
No, you go this way. You go to the right because people like to go right, and they go to the Wizard and stuff.
No.
That's not related to A-Push at all. The Mexican-American War, this itself, while it was a conflict, it really opened the gates of slave versus free. And this was with the new states. People wanted to maintain a congressional balance between slave and free states, which was achieved with the previous ones. When you introduce a whole roster of new states, it becomes harder to maintain that congressional balance, which is where all of this conflict came from.
But before we start into period 5, we should go back and contextualize the Missouri Compromise. It is when Missouri was admitted. Obviously there's big debates over what new territories should become free states and what should become slave states. And because each side, the abolitionists and the pro-slave states, they want to achieve congressional balance, as in there's an equal amount of slave and equal amount of free representation. All right, does anyone explain what the Missouri Compromise was?
The Missouri Compromise stated that north of a certain line that they drew in the United States, all states would be free, and then south of that, slavery would be permitted, which was a good compromise at the time, but when admitting these new states, it was kind of hard to maintain that because this would upset the congressional balance.
I mean, it initially helped to maintain the balance of power between free and slave states, but it was eventually repealed. By the Compromise of 1850.
Yeah, but let's go back a little bit before that. Let's talk about the Kansas-Nebraska Act, Kansas.
All right. So the Kansas-Nebraska Act was it was a territory that was split by Stephen A. Douglas, and it allowed the citizens of that territory to vote on whether they should have a free state or a slave state.
This is called popular sovereignty.
Yeah. And this kind of angered the Northerners because they had a chance of having a free state, which eventually failed. And then you had Franklin Pierce, who was the president after him, who recognized the slave state government, which kind of angered the Northerners. And
Yeah. But the this Kansas-Nebraska Act led to something called Bleeding Kansas, which is a big conflict. This exemplifies the whole conflict of the era of slave versus free, because people poured in from all across the nation. People in favor of slave states rushed in, and people in favor of a free state flushed in. And here they fought because they wanted to sway the votes to be
in the favor of whatever side they're representing. So as everyone was flooding in, it's like two opposite sides of a conflict where it's butting heads. Obviously there's going to be bloodshed.
Yeah, this wasn't just a political conflict. There's actual bloodshed. There's fighting, physical fighting. It's called, hence the name, Bleeding Kansas.
And in the end, it resulted in the slave state vote actually winning. So Kansas did become a slave state.
Yeah.
There's another conflict regarding the fugitive slaves.
Compromise of 1850.
Yeah, that came from the Compromise of 1850.
Explain the
Can you go over the Compromise of 1850?
Yeah, sure. All right, so the Compromise itself was proposed by Henry Clay, which he was kind of a peacemaker. This is not the first time he's making a new compromise. It basically admitted California as a free state, which angered the slaveholders in the South, and it is the establishment of the territories in New Mexico and Utah, where the question of slavery would be determined by popular sovereignty, also angered the Northerners. Yeah. And the abolition of the slave trade, but not slavery itself, in the United States. And it also introduced this actually enforced the Fugitive Slave Act
in the North.
Yeah, which required the Northerners to return any slaves that tried escaping. They tried returning them to the South.
Yeah, this usually in the past, compromises like the Great Compromise, compromise have solved to quell conflict. Not this time. This time it would just angered people in general. The idea was that hey, if we make California free and then these other two states popular sovereignty, and then also enforce the Fugitive Slave Act, everyone will get a little bit of what they want. But people didn't just want compromise. People either wanted slavery or no slavery. So this just served to anger people even more and just increased completely the tensions between the North and the South.
And following this new compromise that had the Fugitive Slave Act, there was a Supreme Court case called the Dred Scott versus Sanford Supreme Court case, in which Dred Scott, a fugitive slave, escaped his master. Actually, the master died, right?
I believe the master died.
Yeah, he died, and he dipped to the north, and then someone recognized him, and they had him return to the South, but he took this case with the Supreme Court itself. Now,
The only problem with his argument was that the Supreme Court that he was ineligible to sue based on the fact that since he was a slave, he was not granted the rights that a citizen had. Therefore, he could not sue legally in court.
it was chattel. He was technically property, so he couldn't really sue anybody
Yeah.
since he was not a citizen.
Yeah.
Now, following this also was John Brown.
Oh,
John Brown, Harper's Ferry.
Harper's
This guy's
Ferry.
awesome. John Brown is like the coolest guy ever.
spoiler alert! Spoiler alert! He loses.
Now, before he loses, John Brown organizes a plan with him and his sons to march over to Harper's Ferry and bring over a bunch of guns.
Harper's
and-
Ferry, by the way, is a military fort.
It was a
Yeah.
military bunker, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
They were trying to steal armaments.
They
Yeah.
want to steal armaments. The idea was that, hey, we'll steal armaments, we'll steal a bunch of armaments and arm these slaves and start a slave revolt.
Yeah, because they were part of the radical abolitionists.
Radical abolitionists, yeah. But no one showed up, and they
got outnumbered and
No, they
seized.
showed up. It's just the slaves refused to help them.
slaves didn't.
They just not help them. And South saw this as an act of terror.
South
coming
lost their minds.
directly from the North, and that was the problem. The Northerners
Speak
saw
up.
this. The Northerners saw this as a act of what do you call it? Like patriotism.
An act of aggression.
Yeah.
They saw this.
That
as
was South. That was South.
No, the South saw this thing act
Yeah.
of aggression. So it was a direct attack on their values, and they took this as a method to like, hey, this planted the seeds of, hey, we need to get away from the North. But this is not the only catalyst. The main catalyst for the South really wanting to leave from the North was the election of 1860 with the presidential election of Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln was an open member of. He openly stated that he does not want slavery to spread anywhere.
Which is the Free Soil platform.
The
he
free soil,
Which is
platform.
against the extension of slavery into newly acquired territories.
Yeah. And when he became elected, Southerners saw this as their way of life effectively ending. So they decided instead of letting this just happen, we're gonna secede. So the South secedes from the North in 1860, starting with South Carolina. South Carolina was the first state to secede, and then the rest of the South followed. This started the Civil War. Guys want to explain the Civil War?
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
it was brutal. It was between the Union, which is also known as the North, and they were the abolitionists, led by the U.S. government, Abraham Lincoln. And then we have the South. By the way, the North government was Ulysses S. Grant. You'll hear him come up later, as he's a future president. And the general of the South, and effectively their leader, Robert T. Lee, led the Confederates, which was all the southern states that seceded in favor of slavery.
Yeah. This was a big conflict. This is the biggest, fighting conflict of the era.
Bloodiest war in American history.
Bloodiest war in American history. Most American blood spilled just because America was on both sides. There's a lot of, land destruction, too. The North laid siege to the southern lands and really destroyed a lot of things, like Sherman's March especially. Sherman's March was a campaign by the North where they blazed through the South, set things on fire, destroyed train tracks. This mass destruction during the actual war led to our next big conflict, the Reconstruction era. The Reconstruction, you guys want to talk about the Reconstruction?
Yeah, so the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments are all known as the Reconstruction Acts. The 13th Amendment banned all slavery in any form. The 14th Amendment gave the slave citizenship, and the 15th Amendment protected those rights.
No, and then right to vote, too.
Yeah, no, the right to vote was included. I believe that was his 14th Amendment.
Yeah, just think like it was included within these amendments.
Basically, on paper they had all the rights, but people found ways to go around them.
But the Reconstruction, the North knew that the South would kind of not want to enforce these acts, which is why Reconstruction happened.
And they thought there had to be some form of punishment for it too.
Yeah, this is
Yeah, you had the radical Republicans,
yeah.
which kind of like
This
enforced
is an
these
inter party conflict, because like
Yeah.
people like Lincoln, they wanted the 10% plan,
Yeah.
which is like only 10% of each nation needs to like say, hey, we're okay with being the union to be admitted back in. But there's this other like section of Republican. Lincoln was a Republican, by the way. But there's this other section of Republicans called the Radical Republicans.
Yeah, these guys just wanted revenge, like brutal punishment against the South, and it didn't even stop there. The South tried doing sharecropping, which was basically paid slavery. Slavery, but you
No,
had to,
it was
all, like,
contract. It was like essentially contract
contracted
slavery.
labor.
These people would get in contracts, essentially work as slaves and get paid at the end, but they did not get paid in money. They got paid in crop.
And even then, it led them down to like a continuing spiral of like never-ending debt.
Yeah.
Even
So the Southerners found ways to continue slavery or segregation.
Yeah.
such as
Reconstruction.
Jim Crow.
Yeah.
Segregation.
No, Jim Crow didn't happen.
poll
quite yet.
taxes.
No, we need to discuss Reconstruction first.
Reconstruction.
Reconstruction divided the South into military zones, patrolled by the North. And through this patrol, Black Americans were able to ascend to many different political roles. Black Americans could be able to become like governors, senators, and whatnot. But the South continually throughout this Reconstruction, there's conflict as they were always resisting. They made it very clear they didn't want to be in this arrangement. They're constantly not physically fighting, but there's always political dissent against these soldiers, these Northern soldiers.
And
Yeah,
this caused a lot of conflict between the Southerners and the North, because now the North was stepping into Southern territory and acting like they ran the place, and it ended up failing due to Southern continued resistance.
Yeah, and then the Reconstruction eventually ended with the election of President Rutherford B. Hayes. President Hayes was a Republican elect, but the thing is, it was a very, very close vote, and it went to the House. So this was known as another compromise, where while Hayes was elected, Reconstruction ended, and all these Northern troops removed themselves from the area. And this led to, as you guys were saying, Jim Crow laws, the Ku Klux Klan, just general unfair poll taxes, unfair treatment of Black
literacy
people.
tests.
Yeah, unfair treatment of Black people in the area.
Essentially loopholes to the Reconstruction amendments.
Yeah. And now with no one enforcing them, they're allowed to freely just exploit these loopholes to no end. This leads to a lot of dissent and
Animosity.
from Black Americans in this area, because they were not allowed to to use the rights they got by the end of the war. You know?
Yeah, I understand what I'm picking up what you're putting down.
Yeah. And this also, like things like the Ku Klux Klan prevented Black people in the area from running for these governmental positions through fear and terror. Lynching, lynch mobs.
Radical white supremacy.
Radical white supremacy prevented a lot of African Americans from entering any governmental positions, and ended essentially what Reconstruction did.
And we'll see this become a common theme over the next 100 or so years.
Yeah. And this is a conflict also, because the North felt like they wasted a lot of money with Reconstruction, because Reconstruction was not cheap. It cost a lot to put all these troops in the South. It cost a lot for all this patrol, the military zones, and for it to just end in essentially nothing changing, besides just slavery being on paper abolished, was just greatly upsetting for much of the North.
And these conflicts, though not necessarily in war form, we will see these two sides clash and butt heads over the next 100 or so years. But for right now, the U.S. focus shifts more towards the industry and the conflict between the common man, the lower class, and the higher classes and corporations, which we will see continued into the Gilded Age. Well, that was period 5 in APUSH, covering everything from the years 1848 pretty much to the end of the 19th century. Next period, like I said, we'll be going over the Gilded Age, but until then,
We'll see you guys next time.
On
I love
Footlong
you.
With American Cheese.
I love you.
I don't.